2 years ago, I moved to Greenfield, in a very quiet neighborhood. My new house was on 3 levels and had a large garden. That house was really big for just one person, but I've always loved spacious areas that allow me to move freely and enjoy a sense of freedom and comfort. Near my house, there were 7 other residences, and one of them was Mrs. Johnson's residence, a wealthy woman who lived with her 3 dogs and her maid Allison. Since becoming a widow, Mrs. Johnson had developed an obsession with the Smith family, who lived in the house next to hers. It was said that she scrutinized their every move as if the mere thought of the Smiths filled her with terror. The Smith family consisted of 6 people. During the day, they seemed like a normal family, like any other, but at night, strange noises emanated from their home, sending shivers through the entire neighborhood. It was said they had a daughter, Emily, who had never been seen in public. There were rumors circulating that Emily was trapped inside the house, confined to a dark room and forgotten by the outside world. But there was no certainty about any of this. Despite several reports from neighbors to the police, during various checks, the officers had never found anything strange. Mr. Anderson, across the street, was convinced that the Smiths were involved in dark practices. I don't know why he had this idea, perhaps because of the strange noises coming from their home. He was firmly convinced that they were hiding something horrible, probably in their basement. Occasionally, he dared to peek through the window, seeking confirmation of his suspicions. One day, around 2 p.m., the door of the Smiths' house was left ajar as the family left. It was an unusual event, almost unthinkable, considering how careful and reserved the Smiths usually were. It was definitely a distraction, otherwise they would never have left the door open. Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Johnson, and I happened to be near the Smiths' house when we noticed the door ajar. That moment was like a wake-up call for us, an opportunity we couldn't let slip away. We finally had to find out what was happening behind those walls. We couldn't remain in uncertainty and continue to live that way. The situation in the neighborhood was becoming increasingly tense, with gossip spreading among the residents. Every little detail about the Smiths became a topic of discussion among the neighbors, fueling curiosity and suspicion. I too was not immune to this atmosphere of mystery. Every time I passed by the Smiths' house, I felt a shiver down my spine as if something sinister lurked behind those walls. Despite the fear and anxiety that engulfed us, curiosity and determination to resolve the situation drove us to act. It was time to put an end to all the mysteries that had been tormenting the entire neighborhood for too long. With my heart pounding furiously in my chest, we looked into each other's eyes and encouraged one another. We had to enter that house, at any cost, to finally uncover the truth. With uncertain steps, we approached the slightly open door. Once inside, we found ourselves in an eerie dimness, with silence seeming to envelop every corner of the house. Our gaze scanned every corner of the house, searching for clues that could reveal the secrets hidden by the Smiths. Despite our searches, we couldn't find anything suspicious. At that point, we decided to check if Mr. Anderson's suspicion that there was something in the basement was true. We headed towards the door, but unfortunately it was locked, which made us suspicious. Why would anyone lock a door when only family members are at home? What could be the reason? That detail couldn't go unnoticed and only served to further fuel our suspicions about what was hidden down there. We looked at each other, tension mounting. We had to find a way to open that door and discover what lay behind it. We decided to search the house for something that could help us open the basement door. After about 10 minutes of frantic searching, we found nothing that could help us. The lock seemed to be of a particular type, much more complex than we had imagined, making it almost impossible to open without its key. So we decided to focus on finding the key itself. We inspected every corner of the house, looking inside every drawer, wardrobe, piece of furniture, and anywhere it could be hiding. However, despite our efforts, we couldn't find any trace of the basement key. Frustration began to set in, and the tension between us intensified. We knew the basement key had to be somewhere, but where? It was clear that it had been carefully hidden. Suddenly, Mrs. Johnson let out a cry of joy and exclaimed, "There's a key behind that painting. Let's hope it's the one." Mrs. Johnson had noticed something unusual behind one of the paintings hanging on the wall. The fabric keychain was slightly hanging from the back of the painting. At that point, we headed towards the basement door, hoping that the key we had just found was the right one. When we inserted the key into the lock and turned it for the first time, a shiver ran down our spines. It was. The fact that the key had been so carefully hidden and had opened the basement door almost confirmed to us that there was something strange down there, something that the Smiths had tried to keep hidden at all costs. I flicked the light switch and we began to descend the stairs with our hearts in our throats, the fear of what we might find down there accompanying us with every step. When we finally reached the bottom of the stairs and found ourselves in the basement, we were speechless at what we saw. A large table dominated the room. On it were laid out old prayer books, candles casting a dim light, and various scented essences filling the air with an intense, almost unsettling aroma. Around the table, various photos of people were scattered, some of them faded with time. The sight of that place confirmed Mr. Anderson's suspicions. He was right. Rituals were performed in that basement. Tension grew as we looked at each other in disbelief. Suddenly, while we were in the basement, we heard noises coming from outside. It was the Smith's car, parking in the garden. We immediately understood that we had to leave that place as soon as possible. Without wasting time, we ran up the basement stairs. I hurried as fast as possible to the painting to put the key back in place and not leave any trace of our presence. Fortunately, just as the Smiths returned home, we managed to escape through a window. At that point, realizing that we could no longer ignore what we had discovered in that house, we decided to immediately call the police. After a few minutes, the officers arrived on the scene, ready to address the situation. We explained to them what we had discovered in the Smith's basement, telling them about the rituals and everything we had seen down there. The officers listened carefully to our words, and when they were convinced of the seriousness of the situation, they decided to intervene. They approached the door of the Smith's house and knocked firmly. When Mrs. Smith opened the door, the officers explained that they needed to conduct a check because some neighbors had complained of hearing the usual noises coming from their home. With some reluctance, Mrs. Smith consented to the inspection. The officers asked to open the basement and verified with their own eyes what we had described to them. At that point, the officers informed the Smiths that from that moment on, if there were any further complaints from neighbors about strange noises or suspicious activities, they would have to leave that house. The decision had been made to ensure the safety and tranquility of the neighborhood. With relieved hearts, we watched as the officers walked away from the Smith's house, carrying with them the promise of a better future for our neighborhood. The truth had finally been brought to light, and now it was up to the Smiths to decide their fate.